Reflections with theologian Father James Bacik, lecturer and campus minister at the University of Toledo.
The idea is, I guess, that the court is opening the door here to other states drawing up restrictive laws, and those eventually would probably go to the Supreme Court as well.
Today on Reflections, Father Bacik talks with Father Robert Kirchner, a priest from St. Clement's Parish in Toledo, Ohio. The topic of this week's Reflections is the abortion debate, identifying the core issues. And now, here is Father Bacik.
Well, Bob, I'd like to talk a little bit about a recent Supreme Court decision. It's the case of Missouri Attorney General William Webster versus Reproductive Health Services, a St. Louis abortion clinic. And I suppose that it will be known as the Webster decision. And I want to talk a little bit about that and the ramifications of that decision. It's probably good for us to get that into some sort of context about what it's all about. I noticed that in that Missouri law there's a preamble that talked about life beginning at conception. And I think that the general sense of that is that preamble is not a law, and that the Supreme Court this time was not really making a statement about when they thought life began, although they did sort of reject the trimester approach used by the court in Roe v. Wade. You want to comment on any of that at all?
Not particularly. I mean, I think that the only function of a preamble as a general rule, and it can vary from state to state, is that a preamble to a statute is not part of the law, and that it simply may afford some indication of the mind of the legislature, the legislative intent in the statute that follows, but insofar as it is then essentially a rhetorical statement, it would hardly be the kind of thing the court would address, and it's hardly the kind of thing from which anybody could draw any conclusions that would be binding on individual persons as such.
That debate will continue on about when human life begins. I notice a lot of the moralists are moving away from any talk about personhood, that the word person is such a sliding term that they often feel it just muddies the waters here. And that I notice they more often speak about nascent human life or potential human life when they begin to try to talk about what fetal life is all about. But the language of personhood does seem to get in the way, because when we talk about person, we're usually meaning someone with ability to communicate, one who is able to love, and so on. At least in the popular mind, I think that's how it comes across, and that's how the word seems to function. So I think a lot of the moralists move to a more neutral kind of language, which would be potential human life.
Yeah, I'm not sure I like that movement away from the use of personhood, because obviously the difficulty with regard to that thing is that you have a continuum of life that begins at the time of conception, or at least nidation, and goes on, if it's in favorable circumstances and undisturbed, all the way through what we recognize clearly as human life to death. And it may be 80 or 90 years later, and that at some point in that continuum we would very much object to the denial of the use of the word person. And we do think of the personhood of the newborn infant, which is about as expressive as that of the unborn child, and so that I don't. That's not something I feel very sympathetic with.
Mm-hmm. The other part of this, of the Missouri law, and that's what the Supreme Court does, right? They're looking at state laws, and they're trying to see if they believe that they're constitutional or not.
Yeah, if they violate rights that guaranteed in the questions of constitutional review, they're looking to see if the state laws infringe some constitutional right.
Right, that's their function. Now, what the state law of Missouri said is something like this, that physicians must use medical tests to determine viability of fetus, that is, whether the fetus can live outside the womb or not. Whenever a woman who appears to be 20 weeks pregnant requests an abortion, and it seems as though the court has generally upheld this as being constitutional, that the tests are a reasonable way of advancing the state's interest in protecting potential human life.
I would think that the court might be saying that the state may, if it wishes, require physicians to do that. I haven't seen the decision yet. It was my understanding that the court left the decision to make those tests to the discretion of the physician, but I'm not sure.
The physician would have to end up making that judgment.
Whether or not the test was called for, yes.
Yes. That's the impression I get in reading the news reports, too. And then the other part of the whole Missouri law that they were dealing with said that state funds employees in hospitals may not be used to provide abortions or encourage or counsel women to have abortions. Now, that's state funds may not be used. Now, I think we're talking about public institutions,
Sure.
in other words.
That's
So
right.
the Missouri law is very restricted. It's not saying anything about what could happen in private hospitals and so on.
That's right.
Or even abortion clinics that have no state funding. So it's very restricted, but the idea is, I guess, that the court is opening the door here to other states drawing up restrictive laws, and those eventually would probably go to the Supreme Court as well.
Yes, I rather imagine they would.
In other words, you say that as sort of with a weary look, that you think that this is going to happen, and we're going to continue getting cases like
Well,
this.
they
already took on cases.
Yeah, well, there were a lot of ramifications of Roe versus Wade, and as a matter of fact, I don't think there's been a term of the court where some aspect or other of the whole large abortion issue has not been on the court's docket.
Bob, what is going to happen now is we're going to get this debate carried on, I think, in the state legislatures, and hopefully that the ordinary citizen is going to be in on the debate and to try to do it intelligently and rationally and without just using slogans and so on. And one of the things I'm borrowing here from Father Richard McCormick's what he called 10 rules for debate about abortion. And I want to just run a couple of these by you and see what sort of reactions they promote. One, he says, make sure you represent the other positions, the other person's position fairly.
Mm-hmm.
Now, that's something that we always try to do in debate. And so that one of his points in exemplifying this, he says, don't say that a woman who hasn't had an abortion necessarily has no respect for nascent life. Because, in other words, be fair about it. Because you and I know, in dealing with women who are in this situation, in pastoral situations, that they very often are just torn, and it's a very difficult thing for them to manage. They're often not thinking clearly. There's all kind of pressures upon them and so on. And so I think just to say that any woman who's had an abortion, and there are large numbers in our society, simply have no respect for incipient human life, it really is not fair. I mean, we know that. And so that would be one example of where we would perhaps fail to represent the other positions fairly.
Yes, it seems to me that nobody can really espouse a pro-life position very well unless he or she does understand, in fact, why people do have abortions, why they feel driven to it. And that excludes the abortions that are done as a matter of convenience, which I think is something that most people would repudiate. But where you get a person who, because of a social situation, economic situation, the fear of bringing a severely deformed child to birth, things of that sort, cases where very often, were it not for the skill of modern obstetrics and gynecology, the child would be aborted naturally before term anyhow, and isn't now because of the quality of care. You take all of those things, the person who's in favor of pro-life has to understand why that woman feels compelled to have an abortion.
Right, and very often that seems to be missing in the debate. I think what people often don't like about that really radical position is that they don't feel an empathy for the women who are in this situation. And I think the pro-life movement will be far more effective when they demonstrate that kind of empathy, and not just an empathy for the woman, but an understanding of the social situation which often produces this need or felt need for an abortion.
Sure, and on the other hand, I think it is equally important for the pro-choice people to understand what in heaven's name the pro-life people are upset about. I mean, to understand fully the foundations of that position, the respect for life, at least for nascent life in the womb, which explains why the pro-life people are so intensely committed to their cause.
That's, again, what McCormick makes the point, that it really is not fair to say that pro-life people are simply involved in what he calls a total preoccupation with the status of the unborn. That we have in the Catholic community a talk about the consistent ethic of life, in which our leaders, at least, are very insistent on the idea that we in the Catholic community want to promote life at all stages of development, and that leads them to a position to be against capital punishment, for example, and has led them to write their pastoral letters on the economy and on peace. that consistent ethic of life they want to see applied across the board. And therefore, I think it would be, again, unfair on the side of the pro-choice people to say, well, the pro-lifers are just interested in fetuses and nothing else.
Even at the expense of the life or the convenience of the mother,
right,
or the health.
Well, that has always been a false kind of charge.
Sure.
I mean, leveled against Catholic pro-life people. That has never been the case. The example of the ectopic pregnancy or of the cancerous womb has always been an exemplification of that. There really is a general feeling. In fact, I heard it repeated on Nightline, and Ted Koppel himself said it, and there's few more knowledgeable people around, and he really did say something like that one night about, well, the Catholic position must favor the fetal life over the life of the mother. And that really has never been the Catholic position, and it's really unfair to characterize it that way. And the example I always use is that we've always had that idea, if a pregnant woman has a cancerous womb and it's diagnosed as such, that it is a legitimate, good, morally proper thing to do to have a hysterectomy, even though indirectly the fetus is going to be aborted and the nascent life is going to be killed. And we've always said that, and that's been part of our general practice. So the pure blanket statement that we favored fetal life over the life of the mother just isn't true.
No, but at the same time, I've known lots of Catholics who thought that was the position that the Catholic Church was taking.
Yes, that's true.
And I can remember years of teaching nursing students and finding out that whole classes of nursing students would believe firmly that the life of the child was to be preferred to the life of the mother. They didn't agree with it necessarily, but the point is they thought that was what the Catholic position was.
Yeah, so we try to overcome that now and try to make that clearer. I think that many of the Catholic moralists are in a position of saying what you've got very often are conflicting values. And the hard thing is to figure out how to balance those and to work your way through those conflicting rights and values.
Or to work out things in such a way as to show respect for both of the values that are in conflict, the life of the mother, the life of the child, both in danger, and in the measure possible you try to find a solution that is going to respect and preserve both of those values, and to accept only with a sense of profound failure and tragedy when you are not able to preserve both values.
That gets back to one of those things that we would like to see held up as common ground, that abortions are in most cases tragic, that they are undesirable, and that one ought to feel some of the tragedy of that and not just speak about it as though it were evacuating the womb or an act that has no consequences.
That's right. Abortion is always killing, and killing is an awful, violent sort of thing no matter what circumstances it happens in.
Here, let me try another one here to keep this debate civil and to try to help us to work this out in the years ahead. McCormick suggests that we distinguish the pairs right and wrong from good and bad. And so he says the discussion about abortion is about its objective moral rightness or wrongness. And it's not really about the personal, private good or bad intention of those who have had abortions. And I think, again, that he says this allows us to argue without implying evil motives in the other. And so he wants to use the words right and wrong as more objective statements about the situation, arguing about abortion, is it a right or wrong thing to do? Whereas you get into good and bad, you are imputing sort of personal motivation to people. Of course, in the Catholic community, again, we have to make that clear that the Catholic Church does not go around saying that individuals have committed mortal sins. What the Catholic community sometimes says is that this is a serious matter, and this is a grave matter that one has to take with extreme seriousness. It is a very different thing from saying you committed a mortal sin, which is a judgment reserved to God alone and can't be made by any church person of any rank. So that distinction, I think, really is helpful, and it's helpful just in general to avoid what the gospel enjoins upon us, to avoid sort of rash judgment, and judge not because then we would end up being judged. Judgment about moral culpability is finally in God's hands, and to the best of our own ability to judge our own conscience in relationship to the moral law. So I think that would, I mean, we're in there, right? I mean, we have to be part of this whole thing. God is the judge, but we have to end up making determinations about where we think we're at, but I can't do that to you. and make a judgment about where you're at morally.
That's right.
So we're going to talk about the objective moral rightness or wrongness of abortion and get it out of this personal realm of imputing culpability to people.
Yeah, it's a part of the whole ethical tradition of the West is that even though we sometimes don't see them, or if we see them, we don't really feel, for a variety of reasons that we can subscribe to them, that there are objective answers, and that the right answer may vary from one situation to the other depending on the situation. Our whole tradition has been to the contrary, that even if we can't always see them or achieve them in practice, there still are objectively right answers.
Right, and we've talked about that in terms of the natural law.
Sure.
In the Catholic tradition, natural law has often been sort of misused. It's become almost a biological understanding. But at its best, the natural law has always claimed that there is an intelligible structure in reality put there by the Creator, and that the human mind is able to understand that intelligible structure.
Or at least to pursue it with a measure of success.
That's
yes.
right, yeah. Not to get it totally in order, but we're able to conform our mind to that objective structure, and that's what we've commonly called truth. And I think there really is something valuable in that Catholic understanding of natural law and this whole debate that we have to hang on to and keep in front of ourselves.
That's right, that's right. And I think that's one of the things that comes out in the quarrel about the role of sex education, for example, in dealing with this whole large area of which abortion is a part. And that is that while no doubt a large part of the business of being morally good is a matter of goodwill and firmness of will, nonetheless, knowledge to begin with is an indispensable foundation, and people are going to be hopelessly muddled, I think, very often when they come to concrete decisions they have to make without having that context of understanding, at least, of what values are caught up in it. I'm afraid that very often, as you suggested, as the abortion debate has gone on since Roe versus Wade, that people have been pushed to one extreme or the other, and they become single aspect of single issue people, which is, I think, profoundly unhealthy.
Let's try to follow up on that, Bob, and one of the things we would want to try to identify in the whole thing is what is the core issue. Now, it looks to me like you've got two different ideas going here. On the pro-choice side, the core issue is seen as one of freedom and rights. It's as though the people have a great sense of the Enlightenment tradition, that gradually we've moved along and said we have to ensure people have their rights, and we got to make sure that people are not discriminated against, and so on. And here we have women in our society who are often put down or second class. They're the ones who carry the pregnancy. And so the debate is framed in terms of the woman's right vis-a-vis the state, which is going to come in and invade her privacy. I think that is the way the pro-choice people, when they try to work it out, that's how they frame the debate. As someone has said, it's a two-party debate. It's the state and the pregnant woman. And, of course, in that debate, what they want to do is come down on the side of saying, well, the pregnant woman has rights. You don't want the state interfering in all of that. On the other hand, it seems to me the pro-life position sees the equation, the moral equation, in broader terms. It says it's not just the woman and the state. What you've got is the rights of women, value of their, and you got have a lot of empathy for them, and they're the ones who are carrying the child and are open to social ridicule and problems and so on. But then you also must factor in the rights of the fetal life. The fetus has rights as well. And then you ought to think about the rights of the father. He ought to be in the moral equation. And then there's the general broad concerns of the society as a whole that have to be factored in. So it seems to me the Catholic contribution to all of this debate is to say that the framing of the question simply in terms of state and women's right to privacy is too narrow a way to frame it. That we have to frame the question in terms of these larger issues and the rights of the fetus, the mother, the father, and the concerns of the state as a whole. And that's where you really get your difference. What is the core issue? And how do you frame the question? And I think it's good, at least in my mind, to clarify that. I find that helpful to keep in mind. That's why we keep coming up with different answers. We get different answers because the question is different. So we got to somehow begin to talk about what's the proper way to frame the question.
Oh yes, and the answer is going to depend a lot on the way the question is framed. I think that's true. Catholic social thought in its development in modern times in Europe, has always stressed the idea that there are between the individual person and the state a variety of other social structures, that the state itself is not all-encompassing, but rather there are, quite independently of the state, other structures within society, and those structures represent for each of us a whole complex, both of expectations that we have of others and of responsibilities that we have toward others. That there are other people beside the state that can come and ask us why we have done what we have done, and there are other people besides the state to whom we should perfectly rightly go for help when we need something in return.
We should keep that traditional Catholic distinction in mind between the state and society, don't you think? You're a great teacher and our mentor, or John Courtney Murray, I don't know if I use the right word there, but a person I know you have great respect for, drew that distinction out of the long Catholic tradition, and I find it to be helpful very often. To say society is not the same as saying state.
That's right.
We say state, we think government. When we think society, we think the whole social body, and with its many actors and its many various communities.
Sure. And yeah, that's a tremendously important decision, because most of the really important things in our life are in the area of society that is not covered by the state. The state is one segment of a large pie, but you think of the family, you think of the neighborhood, you think of the local community, you think of the economic communities to which we belong. A whole variety of things have a great deal to do with the quality of our lives. But I think we're moving a little bit away perhaps from the abortion issue when we talk about that. It is simply, I think, to get back to that point, that on the one hand, the legitimate claim of the individual to be free of interference by the state or by others must be balanced by the consideration of the legitimate claims that we human beings have upon one another. Yes, by all means.
I think that one way of saying it is that the pro-life people, and I think what I consider to be the general Catholic position says that fetal life must be brought within the pale of those who are protected by the law. Mm-hmm. That they must be seen as members of the human community, and that is the core issue. Is fetal life, the nascent human life, to be protected by the law, and is someone going to speak for the unborn life, or are we going to set them aside as not being governed by the general laws of respect for life? Mm-hmm. And I think that is the sort of the thrust of what we're trying to accomplish, I think, within the Catholic community, is get them included in the moral equation. Don't simply rule them out.
Yes, I think to many pro-lifers it seems that the people who are pro-choice, to use those shorthand terms, simply are not willing to take into account that there is any other consideration beside the consideration that the woman herself may want to take.
Bob, here's another thing that we might keep in mind here about if we're going to have a civil debate and eventually solve this whole vexing problem of abortion, is that McCormick suggests that we try to be open and be self-critical about our own positions, that we are willing to admit difficulties and weaknesses in our own position as we try to argue it. And I think that's always a good rule for dialogue. We need to be self-critical so we don't just come across as having all the answers and not being able to improve. He says, he gives some example. He says, some people would simply say that one group cannot impose their views on another group in the society. Mm-hmm. And he says that the problem with just that simple position is that, but what if the other group thinks that what's happening really is the killing of human life? Then then the position becomes more complex. You can't say to them, well, just, let us do it, and you don't have to have abortions if you don't want to. That's your private business. But it's too simplistic in a way. It misses the bite of why we've got this strong pro-life movement, because people in the pro-life movement say, no, we're dealing with nascent human life, at very least potential human life here, and we just can't set aside and say, okay, go ahead and do that. We feel a responsibility to try to protect the unborn life.
Mm-hmm. Well, sure. I think one of the things that often has to be considered is that Christianity has for a long time said that robbing banks, for example, is bad, but that doesn't mean that when we seek laws that keep our deposits in the bank safe from the bank robber, the yegg who's going to blow the safe, that we're somehow trying to impose our morality upon potential bank robbers.
He takes up the other side, Bob, and I don't know, maybe you can help me sort this out. He says something like this, that the argument that the fetus is inviolable from the moment of conception seems to run into certain problems when you start thinking of the pre-implantation stage. That there's a large number of spontaneous abortions that occur during this period. And he says that should at least raise some questions about the absolute character of this principle, of the inviolable character of life from the moment of conception. So, in other words, I know that there's some theologians who want to say there's something different about the pre-implantation stage than after implantation has occurred.
I think there's no question that the scientists are going to have to be able to tell us a great deal more about the physiology, say the development of a neural system, before we can begin to come up with some kind of satisfactory alternative. It seems to me that the people who talk about life beginning at the moment of conception are in fact talking about the safe side of an issue where we can't point to a particular thing. But we do know, for example, that twinning sometimes occurs before implantation or nidation and then disappears spontaneously. So that have you had two persons, then you get back to one, what happens? And it doesn't seem to fit consistently with that theory at all, and it is obviously a difficulty.
Do you know if twinning occurs always before implantation?
I don't know that. I'm pretty sure it always does. Yeah. I think.
Right. In other words, that you're still dealing with that period.
That's right. That's right. Because it's at a very early stage of mitosis that happens or doesn't happen.
So the point that McCormick was trying to make there, I think, is that we should be self-critical and careful and precise in our argumentations as we're trying to make our point. And a lot of the argumentation you hear simply doesn't respect that.
And keeping part the questions we have to ask the scientist, the questions of the ethician, the questions we ask the lawyer, and so on, because all of these people have contributions to make to the public dialogue.
Yeah, that's very true. Okay, we've been trying to look at the Webster case, Bob, and we see that it's going to spawn a new debate now, and what we're trying to do is figure out how to carry on that debate in a productive way so we can eventually get to some sort of consensus that will ground an effective public policy. And I think if we really are going to do that, then we have to make some distinctions here and try to talk more objectively about right and wrong. We're going to have to try to identify what the core issue is and how to frame the debate. Now, to all we said, that seems most important to me. Is the debate really just state versus woman's privacy, or is the debate really about women's rights, fetal rights, father's rights, and the concerns of society? I think it's that larger picture that we really need to focus on here, and I think that will improve the debate.
You've been listening to Reflections with theologian Father James Bacik, lecturer and campus minister at the University of Toledo. Today on Reflections, Father Bacik talked with Father Robert Kirchner, a priest from St. Clement's Parish in Toledo, Ohio. The topic of this week's Reflections was the abortion debate, identifying the core issues. If you have any comments on today's show or suggestions for future programs, please write Father James Bacik, Catholic Campus Ministry, 2086 Brookdale Drive, Toledo, Ohio, 43606. Funding for this program was provided by the Catholic Communications Commission of the Diocese of Toledo.